Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Access Blockbusters Pod. This is episode number 52. Thank you guys so much for joining us here as we head into the middle of December. There is a lot to talk about here, and yeah guys, we had a pretty busy week of shows. I guess in the world of the news, breaking news I should say, in terms of movies, there wasn't a whole lot to talk about, and I have a couple interesting segments that I wanted to, to try out here, rankings again, and talking about KRAVEN the Hunter, but most importantly for this episode, it's really about the shows. We're going to talk about Dune Prophecy, we're going to talk about CREATURE COMMANDOS, and we're going to be talking about Skeleton Crew. I almost forgot Skeleton Crew. And that's going to be the way it is for the foreseeable future. Hopefully, going to go through the end of those series and their runs, and maybe a little bit of a break during Christmas and during the holidays, but we'll be back and we'll be finishing out those shows. So it's really exciting, guys. It's really exciting. But if you are not subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, make sure to do so. Make sure to subscribe. Give this video a like if you're listening on YouTube. Let me know in the comments what you think about any of the topics down below. And if you're listening on Spotify, and for those of you who don't know, we do have an audio-only Spotify platform. Make sure to go check it out if you're interested and leave a rating and let me know on any platform, YouTube, Instagram, email, what you think about the podcast. I'd really love to know. Guys, that'll do it for the intro, and let's get into these topics, shall we? Alright, so there's a little film coming out pretty soon. It's called KRAVEN the Hunter. I don't know if you've heard of it. I am personally planning on going to see it just to see what in the world the new film in the Sony Spider-Man universe could possibly bring to save a dying franchise, ? Now, for those of you who are unaware, there's a deal that Sony has with Marvel where they basically, long story short, have to just continue to make movies that are related to Spider-Man and his characters, including his Rogues Gallery, which is what they've been doing lately. And they have to make a movie basically I think they have to have a movie in production every 6 or 7 years, something like that. And if they do that, then they get to keep the rights to Spider-Man. That's why they're doing what they're doing. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that they have to continue on this current path that they're on, because the current path that they're on, they're using this shared cinematic universe style of filmmaking with these Spider-Man villains. And so they started out with Venom, then they did Venom Let There Be Carnage, I believe. I think that was the next one. Maybe I'm wrong. I think it was Venom, and then it was Venom Let There Be Carnage. Morbius was there somewhere. Madam Web was there somewhere. And then Venom The Last Dance was there. And now we have finally reached KRAVEN the Hunter. And the question that I have here is not necessarily, is KRAVEN going to be good? Because, whether or not KRAVEN is good, I think is a little bit irrelevant to this question of if it even matters anymore what KRAVEN the Hunter does. And if KRAVEN the Hunter can even affect the Sony universe at all. Because here's the thing, right? The Sony universe has not had a quote-unquote good film in it since the first Venom film. And even the first Venom film was critically pretty much panned. But let's go down the list here. Venom Let There Be Carnage was actually liked by critics a little bit more, but I believe audiences didn't like it as much, and it didn't make nearly as much money as it did the first one. Venom The Last Dance was critically panned as well, and the audiences also didn't seem to like it, and it's made some money, I think $400-ish million, so there is that. But it also was kind of a thud for, the ending of the Venom franchise. Morbius was Morbius. We all know that. Madam Web was Madam Web, somehow arguably worse in terms of the critical reception and the audience reception. And so now it comes down to KRAVEN the Hunter. Because yes, Sony is making the animated Spider-Man films and they're doing fantastically. But these live action ones have just been miss after miss after miss, and we now have KRAVEN the Hunter. And the question is really, if KRAVEN the Hunter is the best movie ever made, is it going to save the Sony universe? If KRAVEN the Hunter is the worst movie ever made, is it going to kill the Sony universe? And I think the answer is no. To both questions. I think it just doesn't matter, because honestly, guys, if we go into KRAVEN the Hunter and we see, it's just a terrible, terrible movie, I don't think this does anything. I think that Sony's just still going to keep trying to make these movies. Maybe they'll just reboot, and maybe they'll just, try other things with these characters, but I don't think so anymore. I think Sony is just really dead set on continuing to make these movies. Now, we don't have an announcement for any other movies because, guys, can you believe this? 3 Sony Spider-Man movies came out this year. We had Madam Web, we had Venom 3, we had KRAVEN the Hunter. That's 3 times as many Sony Marvel movies as the MCU had, which was just Deadpool and Wolverine. Next year, though, I don't believe there's going to be any Sony Universe Spider-Man pictures. In fact, Spider-Man 4 is entering production, but that's part of the MCU. So really, I don't think we have any more, Sony projects in confirmation. I know that there were rumors of an Agent Venom movie or whatever, but nothing has been confirmed by Sony. The El Muerto movie is dead as far as I know, and so nothing is confirmed. So the question is really, what happens after here? Venom 4, not likely. Madam Web 2, very not likely. Morbius 2, very not likely. KRAVEN the Hunter 2, well, that just depends on how KRAVEN the Hunter 1 does, and we'll see about that. So really, the question is, what happens after this, KRAVEN the Hunter film? And I don't know. I just think the likeliest answer is that Sony just makes up something else and then, sends it into production. The Agent Venom film seems like, as good of a guess as anyone else's, but I think Sony's really just hoping KRAVEN the Hunter is good and they can make another one of it, because honestly, I don't think it matters. I think that, we've been talking about this for a while, but it's just a rights battle at this point. And so the fact that, KRAVEN the Hunter is coming out, look, I hope it's good. I hope every movie is good, but I can't imagine that anything is going to really change from Sony's plans, because they still, they want to keep the rights to Spider-Man, and they're making Spider-Man 4, and at the end of the day, they got what they wanted, which is keeping the rights to Spider-Man, and Marvel gets what they want, which is making Spider-Man 4. So really, I just don't think, KRAVEN the Hunter is going to change the plans of the Sony universe at all, very much. But I will leave that to you guys. Let me know in the comments down below, what do you think the KRAVEN the Hunter movie is going to do for Sony's plans? Are they going to change it dramatically? Is it going to, maybe there's a scenario in which KRAVEN the Hunter tanks and it just completely changes their plans and they make an entirely new universe that's much better, or maybe it just doesn't do anything. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts, so let me know your thoughts about this in the comments down below. Alright guys, let's talk episode 3 of Dune Prophecy. This is going to be our full spoiler discussion, so if you have not seen episode 3 of Dune Prophecy, just make sure to save this video, this segment, this podcast for later, and come back once you have. It is going to be full of spoilers for the episode. Like I've been saying, I've been stalling for just a few more seconds. I'm going to be stalling for a few more seconds, so if you haven't seen it, then make sure to click off and come back. And without further ado, let's talk about the third episode of the show. So, as I always like to do with these spoiler discussions, just want to give a quick recap of my thoughts on the previous episodes, just in case you guys are new to the channel or new to this series. So the first couple episodes, I think we're really good, really solid, I should say. And I say this with the caveat of a couple things. Number one, and I think this correlates to episode 1, the first episode, the premiere, was a little bit slow because I think it was setting up things and it was building towards a lot of other, parts, a lot of other aspects, a lot of other subplots and payoffs that hopefully will be coming down the line. The second episode, I think, then pointed to the other reality of the show that I pointed out in the last spoiler discussion, which is that I don't think this is a show for everybody. And what I mean by that is that, and this was a very common refrain that came out of the first reactions to the show, and I was curious to see what that meant, but I think I understand that a lot better now, is that this show is, it's complicated, but I don't mean that in a sort of condescending way of like, oh, if you don't understand it, it's too complicated for you. No, I think it's complicated for just about everyone. And I think what I mean by that just not being for everyone is just that you have to be really invested in this world. You have to be really invested in the Dune lore. You have to be really invested in these characters. And if you're not, totally fine. But I just don't think that the show is for you at that point. And that's totally okay. I just think that it kind of, your mileage may vary based on how you see those first 2 episodes. So I think that is, that's sort of where I was approaching it. But as somebody who really enjoys the Dune films and who enjoys the Dune lore, I read Dune and I read Dune Messiah. I enjoy those books very much and the world that Frank Herbert has made. I think that this show has been very solid thus far. Now, like I said in my immediate reaction that I posted right after watching the episode, I don't think this episode was particularly strong, actually. I think that this was, easily the weakest episode out of the 3, and I think that it had some pretty significant problems. Now, I did also say, we're going to talk about this as I do a little bit of a play-by-play through the episode and talk through some of my thoughts of the major moments, but I think the first 3/4 of this episode were a little shaky to me, because I think that they were just going through a lot of different things very quickly and cutting back and forth between past and present in a way that just didn't feel purposeful. It just kind of felt like, oh, we're just doing this because jumping back and forth and showing you this and that. And then I think finally in the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes, things started to tie together. But then we ended on now I can say this in the spoiler discussion, they ended on Lila being kept alive. And I was like, well, no, I am more interested in the house wars. I'm more interested in how the Reverend Mothers are and the sisterhood are manipulating the houses. I'm more interested in the Princess Inez and how she's going to factor into the Bene Gesserit's plan. And most of all, after episode 2, I'm most interested in Desmond Hart and his clash with Avalia Harkonnen. And so, the fact that we're now focusing in a little bit more, at least on this keeping Lila alive is maybe not as interesting to me. However, I fully admit that, I don't even know where it's going to go in episode 4. So perhaps it might all tie together very nicely. Maybe she has something more to say about Desmond Hart, and, we'll see. But let's go through episode 3 and talk about this episode before we get into anything else. So we start out here in a flashback sequence. We're on a snow planet. I forget, it's Lankavale or something like that. That's the planet that Valia and the rest of the Harkonnen crew are hanging out on. And so I thought at first, okay, is this going to be a full-on flashback episode, a la episode 4 of The Penguin? Turns out not so much. I might have even preferred if this was just a full-on flashback episode, though I think I understand because this show, like I had said in the immediate reaction, is condensed into 6 episodes. I say condensed because most of the other shows that we've been watching, especially on HBO, have been 8 episodes, right? The Penguin was 8 episodes, and I think that worked a little bit better. Agatha All Along was 9 episodes. This show is 6 episodes, which is, I feel like this episode was the first time you kind of felt that rush going through it, right? You felt like they were kind of trying to rush the pacing just a little bit. But I thought this was going to be a full flashback episode of Tula and Valia, and it was setting up, the distrust and the beef between the Atreides and the Harkonnens immediately because of this whole, I'm not going to say it's subplot, but the storyline with Griffin Harkonnen being murdered by Vorian Atreides. His name is Vorian Atreides. Now, actually, we'll get to that later. I have some confessions to make about this whole Vorian storyline subplot, but we'll get to that later. So Valia, at the very beginning, I mean, even early on, she has a lot of ambition, and it's very clear. I think this is one of the things that these flashbacks are setting up, is the fact that she has a lot of drive, a lot of rage, and a lot of ambition. I mean, it seems like she is the person where the voice originates from that all the Reverend Mothers use. Ironically, when Jessica Atreides becomes the Reverend Mother later on in Dune, I mean, she's an Atreides, but she's using the voice. And I think that's kind of ironic. Obviously, 10,000 years later, but still, just some kind of irony there. So they get into this whole backstory of how Griffin Harkonnen dies. And this is sort of building up the backstory of Alia Harkonnen. And it feels rushed because I think that they wanted to set up the fact that, you don't see Vorian Harkonnen, obviously, because he comes into play much later, or not much later, almost immediately after this, and you don't want to see him because of the whole reveal that Ori is, the guy who killed Griffin and whatnot. But it felt kind of weird and stilted and rushed that you jump from, Valia and Griffin talking together, and then the next scene is, oh, he's dead, and, Valia is all, upset about that. And rightfully so, obviously, but, you see that rage coming up. But it felt like they were just trying to rush through some of these story beats. I also thought they could have spent a little bit more time on this snow planet, Lankavale. I'm going to say Lankavale until someone corrects me. I could be totally wrong. But, they could have spent a little bit more time on this planet, just exploring it and how miserable their lives are. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more depth in spending time with these characters, the Harkonnens, because it just didn't really connect with me. I think Valia the young Valia, I should say, was beginning to connect with me, throughout the episode. And I think the Tula storyline was really the strongest one. And I think that they should have leaned into that more, which I think they tried to, but, they had to pull back into the present every once in a while, which I think really jarred the momentum that this flashback sequence was going into. So anyways, we get this backstory now that Vorian murdered Griffin, and then we are kind of heading back into present day now. And so, we talk about, they're talking about the prophecy, because obviously it's Dune prophecy. And apparently Raquella spoke that prophecy, and she said something like born twice, one out of blood and one out of spice, or something like that. And they think it's about Desmond Hart. So, that's great. That's really interesting. What about it? And then we never find out in this episode. I'm sure we're going to find out in episode 4, but I think that is interesting. Also, we get hints that Lila is in some kind of coma at the beginning, but then this whole thing about, Tula having to let her go, but apparently she just doesn't let her go at the end, which I think is interesting. We'll see where that goes. I think the older woman, the older sister, is a little bit, I don't know, she comes off as so condescending towards Tula, and I maybe that's the point, but I was like, wow. I mean, just let Tula be in her feelings. I understand that, the Bene Gesserit are very much not in tune, or not in tune, what's the right word? Not, receptive to expressing their emotions, as it's very kind of Jedi-like I mentioned in the last episode, of very monk, monastery nuns kind of things. But, I still think that this older sister was like, maybe back off a little bit, maybe because Tula is going through it. But anyways, so then we flash back to Tula, and now she has a love interest. And so this is where I have to confess, and maybe I was tired when I watched the episode. I watched it right when it came out, and in the evening, Sunday evening, and I don't know. Maybe this was exceedingly obvious to everyone. First of all, I mean, I was not cognizant of the fact that these were Atreides until they started chanting Atreides, and then I was like, oh, wait a second. That was much later. That was much later. That was after Ori had proposed to Tula. So I was like, oh, Atreides. Is this guy an Atreides? And then, his name is Ori, and I was kind of like, maybe just some random other Harkonnen. It never once occurred to me that the Ori is a nickname for Vorian, and that's so dumb of me. That is so silly of me. I should have gotten it, and maybe the intention was, I'm assuming that that's what happened, right? Because that's why she killed her. Anyways, I just didn't put pieces together, and I really should have. But again, like my confession, a lot of what I was, talking about here in these notes, and I'm not going to rehash all of them. It's just me being confused about like, why are we cutting back to this guy? And then when she kills him, I'm like, what? And then eventually I understood, and I was like, oh, okay, this all makes sense. So just wanted to, kind of give my own experience of what I was thinking through this episode. I don't think it's the episode's fault. I just think I was not paying attention to the right things, or not looking for the Vorian thing. And if that was, the intention, then good job, I guess, to the show, because yeah. But I also think that, regardless of all of that, it makes I think the scenes here where Tula is healing the horse and all that kind of stuff, it feels, I mean, the point here is that Tula felt kind of abandoned, or maybe that was all a ruse as well, but at least for the front-facing part, Tula felt abandoned by her own family, and so now she's with, the Atreides, but I think it all was a double cross eventually. But I think these parts where she's just healing the horse and whatnot, it's just kind of her, it's kind of this image of this facade of her being like, I'm living a different life now, and I'm not part of the Harkonnens anymore. It just felt a little slow. It's like, okay, Ori's horse died, and now Tula's healing the horse, and now it's like, I mean, I get it on the one hand, but also I, was kind of hoping the episode could have been moving a little bit faster is all. And I think that, at this point I was feeling the episode's disjointedness a little bit more, just cutting back and forth between the present, cutting back and forth between different childhoods. So you have Valia, and you have Tula, and you have the present Tula, and you have the past Tula. And I don't think it's the fact that they were cutting back and forth that was the problem. I just think that it's the fact that none of it felt quite as connected together as I had hoped. And I think that was really one of the bigger gripes that I had with the beginning of the episode. I think it's interesting, though, to see that Tula was sort of the forgotten child. I think that that's interesting backstory, and I hope that plays in. I hope that there is some kind of, verbal confrontation between Tula and Valia later on. And so then we get this scene now where, again, adult show, family-friendly channel, not going to talk about it too much, but Tula and Ori are getting married, so supposedly, and then, as they're, in each other's company, you see outside that they, the other people are chanting Atreides, and I was like, oh, how interesting. And then, once Tula starts revealing her backstory, I was like, oh, I get it. And so that, this is the point. I think it was about 15 minutes left in the episode, and I was like, I get now why they were setting up the things that they were setting up, but I still maintain that the show felt, or this episode rather, felt a little bit all over the place, and just in terms of where they were going, and it felt rushed. I mean, I think that this episode, or these storylines, in themselves could have easily been stretched out into a couple episodes if you're not going to dedicate an entire flashback episode to all this stuff, and you're going to still be back and forth in the present, even though I think the present bits in this episode were not really that interesting, because they were just almost like little reminders of, hey, we're still here, remember us, we're the important part of the show. And I was like, no, I know that, but I'm watching this flashback and I'm thinking this flashback is important. So anyways, but I did really enjoy this, in isolation, again, this little mini Tula storyline where she has to go through this thing where she has to kill all the Atreides and she has to kill Ori, even though I think it's clear that she did fall in love with him, or at least, caught feelings for him, which I think is, again, tragic. I think that, the writing for that character is really good. I just think that in the context of this episode, it felt a little bit, not out of place per se, but just, the way that they cut all this together, it just felt a little bit, disjointed. I keep using that word, but I think it's a word that's appropriate for this episode. So yeah, the entire Atreides family in that area is dead, which is crazy. It's really scary. And I also wonder, and maybe you guys know in the comments, maybe, again, this is just me not paying attention enough, but the boy that Tula lets go after all the Atreides are dead, do we know if that's somebody important? I have a couple guesses as to who that might be later on, because it seemed very intentional that the camera lingered on that boy and then she let him go. We'll see. I have some guesses, but who knows? We'll see from there. So We then get back to Valia and her origin story, and this is the origin story of the voice. I guess this is how she develops the voice that becomes the signature stamp of the Reverend Mothers, and then she walks out of the agony, and then she heads home, and she almost kills, I think, is that her mother that she tells to hold the knife up? But she's defending Tula, which I think is, I think that that's where the bond between the sisters is forming. Although I do see some tension between these two sisters, obviously in the backstory as well. I think that Valia's ambition is getting the better of her, has gotten the better of her in the past. And I wonder where Tula fits into all of this, especially the fact that at the very end of the episode, we see her disobeying Valia, pretty explicitly by keeping Lila alive. I don't know, who knows what Valia would have thought, but she says something like, well, Valia isn't here, is she? So continue the protocol and keep this child alive. And then Valia, at the end of the episode, right before that, I should say, Valia goes and meets some people, and one of the guys calls her aunt. Again, who are these people? Were they in the earlier scenes with the family? They could easily have been. But I again, just setting up some things for the future that I'm like, maybe, interesting. She seems to think it's a desperation kind of play. But I'd like to start seeing where all of this is fitting together now. Because here's the thing, right? As we wrap up this spoiler discussion, this is not episode 3 of 8. And if this was episode 3 of 8, I might have been like a little bit more forgiving of this episode. Not that I hated the episode. I didn't dislike it even that much. I just thought it was a little weak, is what I will say. Because again, everything that I saw pretty much in isolation, I thought was good. I just think that this episode put together was not as strong as the other 2 episodes. But the reason that I might be a little bit, I might be a little bit more harsh on this episode is because I think that when you have only 6 episodes, we are now at the halfway point, and it really feels like we're still just ramping up. The last 3 episodes could be crazy and could have all these things coming together, but I still don't have a good sense of Desmond Hart. I have a decent sense of Valia and Tula, but then other storylines like, the younger sisters, I guess, yeah, the student sisters, I should say. What are they thinking? Because we keep, jumping back to them every once in a while in the present. Also, Inez, we didn't see her at all in this episode, which is fine if not for the fact that this is the halfway point of the series. Kira and Atreides and the rebellion. We have other stuff going on, obviously, with Desmond Hart and the Emperor, the Carrinos. And so I just think that, I'm not necessarily off the Dune prophecy train. I think, on the contrary, I'm still very much invested in this storyline. I'm just maybe a little bit more cautious and a little bit more worried about where the show is going in terms of its pacing, because by the time episode 3, or rather the 50% mark is hit, you should be probably gearing up for, this second half pivot where, things are going to change and pieces are going to move. And at this point, I'm still feeling like we're towards the end of Act 1, if that makes sense. So again, maybe the next 3 episodes are going to change my entire perception of that, but we'll have to see about that. Guys, what did you think of episode 3 of Dune Prophecy? Do you think it is the best episode, the worst episode, or maybe it's in the middle? Let me know in the comments down below. And are you excited for the second half of the season? Let me know in the comments down below. Alrighty, guys, let's talk about the new Star Wars show, Skeleton Crew. This is going to be a full spoiler discussion. So if you have not seen the first 2 episodes of Skeleton Crew, no worries, I'll just make sure to save this segment, this podcast, this video for later and come back once you have, because we will be talking full spoilers about the first 2 episodes of Skeleton Crew. This is your final warning. Here we go. So I always like to start out these segments, especially when we're getting into a new show. It's really exciting because we have Skeleton Crew and Creature Commandos that are starting out this week. And so it's really exciting to dive into new shows. But Skeleton Crew, I like to always give some context with just, how I'm approaching these shows and what my mindset was going into it. And so, like I mentioned in my immediate reaction, the Star Wars shows have been pretty hit or miss. And I am personally somebody who has not experienced quite the lows that a lot of people have. I don't hate any of the shows particularly. I think, for example, Obi-Wan was very disappointing. I think Ahsoka kind of veered off and got, boring and disappointing. I think the Book of Boba Fett was incredibly boring, but, I don't hate any of the shows. I think Acolyte was disappointing. I don't think it was a terrible, terrible show. I just think it was disappointing. On the other hand, I've also always been the kind of person who hasn't experienced quite the highs of, these Disney Plus Star Wars shows. So, I'm not somebody who thinks Andor is terrible. I like Andor, actually, quite a bit. But I do need to rewatch it, admittedly. I'm going to try to rewatch it before Season 2 comes out, and we'll talk about it then. But I was not this kind of person who was like, Andor is my new favorite Star Wars anything. I love Rogue One. love Rogue One, really liked Andor, but, Andor was not the kind of thing where it was like, this is peak Star Wars for me, which again, I admit, I need to rewatch it. It's been a while, so there is that. Even Mandalorian, though, seasons 1 and 2, I was like, this is good. It's good. It's solid, but it has problems with the show structure and, the pacing and the content some of the time that I was like, not really for me, And so I personally, just with these Disney Plus Star Wars shows, I've just been always sort of, it's the range of my likes and dislikes has been kind of small. I've never really loved a show before. But Skeleton Crew, episodes 1 and 2, I loved episodes 1 and 2 of Skeleton Crew. Not without its minor nitpicks and its minor faults, because, everything, it can't be perfect, right? And so there are some things in there that I wasn't a huge fan of, but I think overall, I couldn't believe how much I loved episodes 1 and 2. Now, the caveat to that always, like I mentioned in my media reaction, is that, well, I also really loved... maybe loved is the wrong word. It's too strong a word, but I really liked the first episode of Obi-Wan. I might have even said I loved it at the time. I thought it was great, the first episode of Obi-Wan. And so I just, I'm somebody who's like, yeah, like it's better to be in this position than not, because if you hated the first 2 episodes, well, I mean, sure, you could end up loving the show, but it's a harder hill to climb at that point. It's much easier to, say you love the first 2 episodes and be hopeful, right? So, it's sort of tempering your expectations of saying, just because the first 2 episodes are really good and I love them, and I'll talk about why. Doesn't mean that the show is going to be great, but I have hope, right? This episode, like these 2 episodes did for me what I don't think a lot of the Star Wars shows have done, is, made me fall in love with the story and the characters that they're building. I think even for Obi-Wan, I was like, well, we know Obi-Wan. It's Obi-Wan. And, I'm just interested and intrigued to see where the story is going. The story didn't go where I wanted it to go, or that's not even necessarily the problem. It just didn't go in a way that was satisfying. But, I was disappointed in that regard. But this is a show that I think I've very quickly fallen in love with the characters and with the direction and the tone that they're going in. So we'll talk about all that. So we're going to do our usual play-by-play. I did, take notes for episodes 1 and 2, and so we'll go episode 1 first, and then we'll talk about episode 2. So starting out with episode 1, immediately, the music. I love the music. It's over the opening credits, but it's so whimsical, and it has that, it's just classic Star Wars. It feels very whimsy and adventure, and I love that about the opening. And right away, we have this opening... It's not a crawl, but, the opening text where it's establishing this is right after the New Republic. So, okay, they really love their episode 6, post-episode 6 storylines. I wonder if, they still have plans to incorporate the Skeleton Crew into the rest of their Mandalorian universe. Honestly, after seeing these first 2 episodes, as much as I love these characters, I almost wish they wouldn't. It would feel really weird to see Mandalorian and Luke Skywalker with these kids. Maybe with Jude Law, whoever is Jedi Silvo, Captain Silvo. If that's even his real name. But, I don't know. I just kind of prefer them on their own adventure at this point. But yeah, they're establishing this is right after the establishment of the New Republic. And so we start out with a little bit of a space battle, and it's actual space piracy. And, we've seen, obviously, the first shot of Star Wars, or one of the first sequences of Star Wars ever, was a ship attentive for getting boarded. But, this ship boarding, it's like piracy. It's actual piracy. And it feels much more... I don't know, it feels tactical, and we're going for it, right? It has a very different tone, I think, than other Star Wars projects. And so I think that's really interesting. Honestly, the kind of vibes that I got, and it was especially when, the bridges, right? The bridges between the ships gets destroyed, and then all the pirates start sailing in with their grappling hooks, I don't even know. But they come in and board the ship. And, there's a way in which that looks very fake and very cartoony and very silly, right? I mean, honestly, I'm thinking back to Ahsoka, right? And there's that scene where Ahsoka is just standing on top of the ship. That looked weird. That didn't look right. This, though, there's something about this that, and for those of you who have seen Clone Wars, you'll probably understand what I'm trying to say. It felt very Clone Wars. It felt very live-action Clone Wars, and in all the best ways. I love that. It's the music, too. It's the way that it's paced. I just thought it was fantastic. So we're introduced to Captain Silvo. Very clearly Jude Law. I mean, it's Jude Law's accent, so, very clearly Jude Law. He's wearing the helmet, of course. And then, it's a classic scheme of, there's an empty vault, and so we get this sort of bait and switch, which you see coming, but I don't think that's the point to trick you or anything. And we get the opening prologue of it looks like Jude Law is being undermined by his pirates, which will get picked up at the very end of episode 2. And then we get introduced to our kid. So the first kid up is Wim, and, I mean, I think what they did really well is establishing the backstory is so quickly, because his family life is really sad. We get, a revelation later that I think his mom has passed away, but his dad, it's not like his dad is a negligent father or anything well, negligent maybe actually the right word. It's not like his dad is a malicious father though. It's not like, he's trying, he hates his son or anything. I think he really does care about his son, but in a way that just doesn't really convey itself, I think, in the way that Wim needs him. And I think that that's just really sad. And this poor kid, obviously later we see the scene where he's walking past Neil's house and he sees Neil, and Neil's family is so happy. And that's just such a sad scene. But it's establishing the kids and their backstory very quickly. The other thing that's really interesting, speaking of establishing, is that we get established here Star Wars, but in the suburbs. And, they're going to school. It really is that 80s kind of vibe. And I don't know. Honestly, I don't know how to feel, because it's very close to real life. It looks very close to real life, save for a few things, changed here and there. But those are the suburbs, and that's a school. It's just a droid is teaching, and they have tablets. But they have tablets. He's basically holding an iPad the whole time. And the suburbs look like the suburbs. They're driving around, they're speeders, but they're basically cars and bikes. And I don't know how I feel. Honestly, I think it works well enough. But it's towing the line. It's definitely towing the line between, breaking my, suspension of disbelief, if you will. But anyways, we're introduced now to the second kid, who is Neil. Neil is so cute. You have to have an earnest kid in the group. Kid who's just always, he's not really ready for the adventure, but he gets thrust into it. Kind of the Sam of the group, in terms of Lord of the Rings. Or I guess Sam is a little more, protective, and Neil's just kind of scared. But Neil's so cute, and I love that. I just love the dynamic between him and Wim as well. It's so funny too how that they start out the episode with them pretending to fight with fake lightsabers, because let's be honest, like I grew up watching the prequels, which, say what you will. I grew up watching the prequels and then the original trilogy, and my friends and I, we would also just have fake lightsaber fights and run around and pretend we were Jedi. I mean, it's so nostalgic in a way. And it's not nostalgic even for, it's not like nostalgic in the way that, Toby and Andrew show up, right, in No Way Home. It's nostalgic in a different way, where it's almost like these are the kids that was us. That was really us who was living out that dream and that fantasy of pretending to be in Star Wars, which I think is really, really adorable. But it's so cute. And I think the other thing that I was noticing too, because I was afraid of this, right? I talked about this in my hopes and expectations predictions video, is that I was really scared that this was going to veer into cringy very quickly, like being a very kiddie kind of show. But there is nothing cringy about it. It's so earnest, and yet it felt so accessible and so relatable, and it kind of makes your heart smile, and I think it's such a well done job by John Watts, who is the director of this episode. And for those of you who don't know, he is the director of the 3 MCU Spider-Man films. And I think that one of the things that I also noticed was that this episode, the one that he directed, was directed so assertively, and it has just that kind of quiet confidence that he directs all the Spider-Man films with, which I also just really, really love. So then, anyways, we get the scene here where they're going to the school. I thought it was so funny. It's, not the adult telling all the students that the career fair will decide their future. That hit too close to home. Also interesting that they're talking about this thing called the Great Work. Sounds very, indoctrinating. Very propaganda like, a little close to propaganda. I wonder if they're going to explore this concept of the Great Work. I don't even know what that even means. But it's also really cute because we get more dynamics here, just little kids at school. Neil has a crush on the girl, and Wim wants to be a Jedi. It's so cute. And then, like I said, Wim walks by later on. He walks by Neil's house and sees his family and sees how happy they are. And it's just really sad. It's sad, but it's not in a depressing way. It's just sort of establishing the characters and where they're coming from. So then we get introduced to the next 2 characters, the final 2 characters. That's Fern, and we learn later the other girl is KB. And they're biking and they're trying to fix their bike, power converter, all that classic stuff. So we get back to, and we'll get back to those 2 characters, I'm sure, when they meet up with Wim and with Neil. These names, by the way, every time you start a new show, you have to learn all these names, and I'm getting there. Like it takes me a couple episodes to fully just nail it down, but I'm getting there, guys. It's hard enough with Dune Prophecy, by the way, but now, with Skeleton Crew and CREATURE Commandos, we'll see how well I do. But yeah, so then we get a scene, where Wim's dad is, he asks his dad to tell him a bedtime story, and his dad's like, no, I'm too busy for work. And it's sad, because you can tell his dad's trying his best, but I think that it's just not coming across the way that Wim needs it to. Also really funny, by the way, that they have iPads, like I mentioned, little tablets that are basically reading holographic comic books. I think that that's very interesting as well. So there is that. The one thing I was thinking about too as this episode was going on, because I remember I read through some of the first critic reactions, and most of them seemed to really like the first 2 episodes. I think they saw episodes 1 through 3, I believe. And, there was one review that said something like, I thought the first episode was kind of slow and then it picks up later on. And I thought, I wondered about that as I was watching this episode. I wondered if I didn't know where this was eventually going, that this was going to be a space adventure with these kids in the vein of Stranger Things, Goonies or whatever. I wondered if I would have been also kind of bored by this. But honestly, I don't think so, because these kids, the charisma alone and just the way that they make you care about these characters, I think is more than enough, honestly, to kind of keep me invested. But, I did wonder about that, because right after the prologue with the mutiny, you just kind of spend some time with the kids. And eventually, right as I was writing this down in my notes, then we get into the scenes where they find the ship under the forest. So the show kind of picks up from there as well. And then, so then he finds, the mysterious thing in the forest. It's the classic trope of the kid getting caught up in the adventure story. The dad, he gets caught, first of all, and then he gets basically sent to the principal's office. And you have that very classic disappointed dad moment. Again, all these things could come off as very cheesy and very corny, but it somehow works well, where you're like, oh yeah, like disappointed dad trope, and then you kind of move on here. And, the other thing too, I guess what makes the suburbia or the, kind of school atmosphere feel okay in the Star Wars universe is that this show is really exemplifying what a different side of the Star Wars universe looks like. And I think that's awesome, right? There, let's just say all these different shows that had come out conceptually, had reached their full potential. I think that there is more than enough room for all these shows conceptually. You have Mandalorian, a bounty hunting kind of show, and then turns into kind of a lost, or a found family kind of show with Grogu. You have Book of Boba Fett, which could have been a very cool crime drama or mafia drama, kind of in the vein of Penguin even. It could have been something like that. Ahsoka could have been kind of a continuation of the animation series. Acolyte could have been a really cool prequel murder mystery, and Andor is Andor, a very political thriller. And Obi-Wan could have been, a very somber drama. So I think that all these different shows have different places in the Star Wars universe, and regardless of execution, right? The concepts are there. And I think that this show is just showing another side of that as well. And I think that works very well. So then we get Fern and we get KB. We're introduced to them again more formally, and they, now we got a crew. We got a skeleton crew. And so as they're exploring the ship, I kind of thought this is where it seems like we're heading more towards the Stranger Things vibe. We're exploring the ship. It's kind of dark, scary things, but not really that scary things. Just sort of the ship coming to life. And of course, as one does when you're a kid, press the blinking button, because of course that's what you do. And it is a huge ship. My goodness, it is a huge ship. Also, poor Wim's dad. I mean, again, not the best dad in the world, but he seems like he's not a bad person at heart, and seeing his kid get thrown up into a spaceship into outer space past what they call the barrier, yikes. That is a big yikes. And then the episode ends and they're going off into hyperspace, and at that point, I was so on board with this show. So we head into episode 2 now. In episode 2, every adventure in the Star Wars universe has to have an annoyed droid. It's just custom. And this droid is so funny because I love how they're able to take these droids and give them a little bit of a twist, right? And this droid, this droid is not like K2SO, even though this droid is kind of annoyed and ornery. No, this droid is a pirate droid. It's SM-33, and I can already tell I'm going to love this droid. I mean, even before the droid came and rescued the kids later, what a fantastic droid. Star Wars, say what you will, but almost every single property that they have, they never miss on the droids. The droids are just so much fun. Love the pirate droid. Now they're lost and they're just hanging out in space. I also, by the way, just going back to the droid, I wrote down this quote. He says, talking about Wim, he says, "Shall I throw him out of the airlock for insolence?" Just such a funny droid. I love when Star Wars gets the droids down really well. Also, there are actual skeletons on the ship. Fun. I suppose that's where the name Skeleton Crew will eventually come from. It seems pretty obvious that is what's going on. And so we're moving on here into the spaceport. By the way, I wrote down in my notes at this point, but I just had to reiterate, I was so on board with the show. I was loving the show. Just had to kind of reiterate this for myself because I was just so caught up in it. I was having such a great time there. So we head on to the spaceport, and there's a shady woman trying to get information out of Fern and KB, I guess trying to kidnap them. Really shady, kind of strange. And then, Neil's mouth, they had Neil and Wim head to a kind of bar And Neil's mouth, of course, gets him in trouble, and we start to see all the pirates that we saw in the prologue. Also interesting what's established here, maybe hinting towards why these characters are more important, or where they're coming from is more important, why the ship was there, obviously, in the first place, is that Aten, I think is the name, is a lost treasure planet. So very interesting there. We'll see where that goes. And then SM-33 to the rescue, right? SM-33 is a menace, by the way. Just crazy what he was doing to all the pirates before they knock him out. And they fail and they end up in prison, and it's time for Jude Law. And, I was wondering, because I think that they said in the press releases that he is a Jedi. Jude Law was a Jedi. But I was kind of like, is he a fake Jedi, or what's going on? Is he trying to scam people? But no, he is a real Jedi. It seems, at least he's using the Force, which raises a lot of questions, I'm sure, as he's a Jedi in the post Return of the Jedi era. It seems like Yoda missed out on a bunch of Jedi who were just hanging around there. Ahsoka's hanging around there. I know she's not technically a Jedi, but anyways, kind of interesting. So I'm sure we'll see more of his backstory and where he comes into play. Maybe he will interact with Luke Skywalker. You never know. And he takes off his hood, and that's it. And like I said, I was just so surprised. And I looked at the little timeline, and I was like, oh, 25 minutes? Are you kidding me? It was basically 23 minutes because of the introduction. And that's the one frustrating thing with the first two episodes. Honestly, my biggest complaint is that episode 2 was so short. Episode 1 felt pretty full, honestly. I think it was about 35, 40 minutes long. And it felt pretty full for what it was. Because again, you don't have to make, I don't think all 30-minute episodes are created equal, and I don't think all hour-long episodes are created equal either. I think the Penguin, right? Hour-long episodes, amazing. I think there's a show on Apple TV Plus I keep talking about, Shrinking. 35-minute episodes, amazing. Sitcoms, 22-minute episodes. Some of them are so good. So not all 30-minute episodes are created equally. I think the first episode of Skeleton Crew, really good. But this 25-minute second episode, I was like, are you kidding me? Are we still doing this 25 minutes? Now, again, I still think what we got in this episode was great, but I didn't feel like we fully had gotten what we came for, in the first two episodes. And I don't think that's a discredit to the director. In fact, I think that is a credit to the showrunners and what they were able to do, because guys, it could all go downhill. It could all go downhill. I don't think I've disliked. I feel like the best I could, the worst I could say about any premiere of a Disney Plus show is that I was neutral. I've liked almost all of them. I've loved quite a bit of them. But, it could all go downhill from here. But I would be lying if I didn't tell you I love this premiere. I love the first two episodes of Skeleton Crew. And I'm really excited for episode 3 and where it goes from here. So guys, let me know what you thought in the comments down below about episodes 1 and 2 of Skeleton Crew. Could this be the show that people get on board and rally behind, and it kind of unifies the fan base? Or is this going to be another clunker? We'll see. Let me know in the comments down below. All right, so we've talked about Skeleton Crew, and you guys know, if you listen to the segment and for the previous segment, I loved the first couple episodes of Skeleton Crew. And, I talked about in the spoiler discussion how Star Wars and MCU shows have a tendency to start very strong. I don't remember disliking any particular first couple episodes of any Star Wars or MCU show. And that got me thinking, and I haven't done a ranking on the podcast or the channel in a long time, and I certainly do love a ranking. You can go check out a lot of my videos that are just ranking videos, but I thought it'd be fun to rank all of the first episodes of all the live action Star Wars series. So I have here 7 shows. And I'm not necessarily going to count the first episode of Mandalorian Season 2 or Mandalorian Season 3, because I think this is more about just first impressions of the show overall. So we have 7 shows here in release order. We have Mandalorian, I believe this is release order, Mandalorian, Book of Boba Fett, Obi-Wan, Kenobi, Andor, Ahsoka, The Acolyte, and Skeleton Crew. And we're just going to, from worst to best. In my personal opinion, this doesn't have to be anything close to what your ranking is. It's not even the whole show. It's really not even the whole show. This is just because I was reminded after, watching Skeleton Crew how usually the first episodes of these Star Wars shows are pretty good. And if you guys enjoyed this segment, then let me know in the comments, and let me know if you'd like me to do one for the MCU as well. I can totally do that as well. But this isn't anything super serious. Just wanted to rank, in my personal opinion, the first episodes of all of the live action Star Wars shows, all 7 of them. So let's get into it. Also, spoilers. Minor spoilers for Skeleton Crew, and obviously all the other shows, major spoilers for those as well. So, coming in at number 7, we have the first episode of the Book of Boba Fett. And again, like I said, most of these shows, I don't dislike any of them in terms of their first episodes, because, I think that to be fair, compared to the last episode where you have the whole expectation of the show riding on it, the first episode, the expectations are relatively light. Now, certainly you can have a bad first episode, and then, that kind of derails the whole show, but it's much easier to make a good first impression, at least in terms of these TV shows, I think, because there's just a longer leash. You're willing to be like, okay, maybe not my favorite thing, but let's see where it goes. And I think that was the mentality coming into Book of Boba Fett. Also, if you guys don't remember, because now, in hindsight, the Book of Boba Fett is looked on as so strange. I did a couple videos on a couple podcasts about what was the Book of Boba Fett. I mean, with 2 Mandalorian episodes in there, it was so strange. It was so weird. And then the Book of Boba Fett stuff was just him in a bacta tank, daydreaming or not even just dreaming about Tusken Raiders. And I don't even know. It was such a strange show. But, in hindsight, I think we all look back on it unfavorably. I think, though, we forget how much hype went into this show because it was coming off of such goodwill. It was coming off of, I believe, the 2nd season of Mandalorian, which, it came out, the post-credit scene for the Book of Boba Fett announcing it came at the very end of that Luke Skywalker episode, which is incredible. So, people were really excited. Also, I maintain still, I think it was episode 6 of the Mandalorian season 2. That is one of the greatest episodes of Mandalorian I've seen, the Boba Fett one. It was fantastic. And Boba Fett was brutal. He was vicious, but he was a bounty hunter, but he was not, he wasn't evil. He had principles. It was the kind of Boba Fett that you'd dream of coming back after his, quote unquote death in the Sarlacc pit. So I think people forget, just again, that how much excitement there was for a show like that. And I think the first episode, if you remember, it was basically him and Fennec Shand kind of establishing themselves, walking around. And then the later half of the episode was the beginning of that infamous Tusken Raider bacta tank backstory, which I just think completely stalled any momentum it had, going into that series. But still, I think that the first episode, you didn't really get a whole lot. It was just sort of forgettable in the grand scheme of things. And I don't think it was bad. I just think it was a little bit forgettable. So I'm going to put it at number 7. Coming in at number 6 is the first episode of Ahsoka. Season 1, maybe? Maybe season 1, maybe just the whole series. But first episode of Ahsoka, I think it's fine. I think that we're introduced very quickly to Baylan Skoll and Shin, I believe is his apprentice's name. And then we get kind of reintroduced to all the Rebels characters. It's basically the whole episode. If you remember, the episode ends with Sabine getting stabbed with a lightsaber, which is a little ridiculous. It kind of goes to the whole, anyone can get stabbed. I'm sure if Han Solo didn't fall off the platform in Starkiller Base, he would have survived because he got stabbed. But, I think that it was mostly, in hindsight, more for nostalgia, just be like, we're getting the band back together. Hu Yang, you remember him from Clone Wars, Ahsoka, obviously, Sabine, Hera, Chopper, and we're looking for Ezra. Thrawn mentions. I think it was setting up that kind of story, that kind of show. And for what it was, I was not the biggest fan of Rebels. I'm not going to lie. I was a huge Clone Wars fan, though. And I was a pretty big Ahsoka fan just from the Clone Wars and from Rebels as well. And so I was like, yeah, let's see where we go from here. And obviously, all the Clone Wars fans, regardless of what you think about Ahsoka, we will always have episode 5 of Ahsoka, the Anakin Skywalker episode, the Clone Wars episode. So I will be grateful to Ahsoka for that. But still, I think the first episode was just a lot of Rebels fan service. And I think it is what it is. If you really like Rebels, maybe you really enjoy the first couple episodes of Ahsoka. And I thought it was good. It was fine, but nothing really that memorable. Coming in at number 5 is The Acolyte. And I know this, some of you are going to be like, why isn't this number 7 or whatever? I don't care. I think that the first episode, even the first couple episodes of The Acolyte, were pretty interesting. And I think that what this show had going for it was that it was just different. I think the Ahsoka thing and even the Book of Boba Fett, being lower on this list is just because I think we were just kind of over it, this is all shrinking the universe. This is all sort of characters that we're so familiar with already. And it's like, in hindsight at least, because at the time it was like, let's see where we can go from here. But in hindsight, it was more like, okay, so these are the same characters that we're always watching. I think that The Acolyte had this promise with new characters with Amanda Stenberg and Daphne Keane and Lee Jung-jae and all these actors and new characters, Master Soul and Vernestra and May and Osha. So I think that what The Acolyte did at least is set up, because again, no one was fooled. I wasn't fooled at all for a second. I was like, oh, twins, duh, obviously. But still, I think the action was good. The Carrie-Anne Moss versus Amanda Stenberg's, I guess it was Osha. No, that was May. That was May against Indara, Master Indara. I can't believe I remember these names still. But, I think the fight was really good. I really like Lee Jung-jae. I really thought that the mystery, at least, of, okay, so let's figure out what's going on with the twins, because the twin mystery in itself was not that interesting. And I thought, yeah, I'm on board, and if you, again, you guys can go back on the channel and look, I was on board with the show, at least for the most part. I still think it was a pretty big disappointment overall, but I'm not one of the people who hate the show just because I hate it. I don't have a strong feeling about it in that way. I'm just disappointed because I think the concept was really interesting, and I just don't think it executed that well. But that was the first episode of The Acolyte. I think it was interesting. Coming in at number 4 is the first episode of Andor. Now, I think, and I've said it before, I do have to rewatch Andor because it's been a while. And I think I also remember not watching these episodes of Andor super regularly. I think I maybe, binged a few here and there. And there were, I think there were some episodes that were stronger than others. And I think the first episode of Andor, while it was good, it was certainly really good, it also functions in part, as part of that 3-episode narrative arc. And so you're just setting the scene, right? Now, what we got in the first episode of Andor was quite good. It was setting up Andor and his home planet and his mother and the droid. I don't remember their names, actually, but Bix, I think, is the Adria Arjona. That's the actress's name. Anyways, I think it was just setting up the tone of this post-Empire, world that we're living in. And I think the politics, I don't remember exactly if the politics and Mon Mothma came into play super prominently in the first episode, but we get a little bit of the backstory of him and his sister, I think, and I think that was just it's probably one of the less interesting parts of his storyline because it just never got picked up. So I think just the first episode of Andor, what I really liked about it was the tone that it was setting about this different era of Star Wars and this different world and not different world, but just different side of what it looks like to live under the Empire's occupation. I think that was super interesting, and it set up a very good show overall. So Andor, episode 1. Coming in at number 3 is The Mandalorian, season 1, episode 1. This is the sort of the pilot that kicked it all off, and I thought it was really solid, at least more so at the beginning. I really liked the whole, I can take you in warm or I can take you in cold, and freezing the guy in carbonite, and I think The Mandalorian had such intrigue and mysteriousness about him at the time. We had no idea. Din Djarin, no idea. He was just Mando. I think he met Carl Weathers in that episode, and he goes and rescues Grogu. Obviously, that was the big selling point at the end of that episode. And so I think Kuiil he meets in this episode as well, and that's the big training with to ride the animal and going to rescue Grogu and not IG-88, I forget the name, IG-70 something. Anyways, you guys can let me know in the comments down below. But, Taika Waititi character. So I think it was a really solid first episode, albeit, in hindsight, I also look back at The Mandalorian and go, this isn't a show that I loved particularly, but I liked most of it, I would say. I kind of diminished as the seasons went on, but it's a show that I enjoyed, is what I will say. And so I think the first episode kicked it off in a pretty good way. And it set up, obviously, a lot of Baby Yoda merchandise as well. Coming in at number 2 is Obi-Wan Kenobi. Say what you will about this series, and again, if you hate the first episode, that's fine. If you hate the last episode, that's fine. I'm just here to tell you my opinion, and I think the first episode of Obi-Wan Kenobi is awesome. I think that the promise of the first couple episodes of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I am including young Leia in this as well. I think that young Leia could have been executed very well, and I think that the actress they picked, I think was great. She was awesome, and I think that there are ways to kind of manipulate around the storyline. We don't have to entirely rewrite it or anything like that. That make this a really compelling story between Obi-Wan and young Leia. Also being tangentially about young Luke, that you can kind of have it all fit together with also Darth Vader obviously as well. And I don't think Darth Vader was really in this episode, but I don't think that's what made it really good. I just think that it was setting up the show that we had all thought we were going to get, of this Obi-Wan Kenobi who is devastated by the loss of his Padawan and of the loss of the Republic and Jedi and everyone, and he's kind of called back begrudgingly by who else? The sister of the boy that he is sworn to protect, the Skywalkers, right? I think that is super compelling, honestly. And so, Ewan McGregor is great as always, and I just think that it was a really promising premiere that, didn't really go anywhere after that. But again, I still think the first episode of Obi-Wan Kenobi was really strong. And coming in at number 1, and the reason I did this in the first place is Skeleton Crew, because I cannot remember, and I know recency bias, maybe if the show just tanks from here, and I'll look back on the first episode and be like, that was terrible. I doubt it though, because, recency bias, of course, aside, I just don't remember the last time a first episode of TV that was related to Star Wars and Marvel captivated me like that. I think the last time was really WandaVision. And I'm just so amazed at how much I fell in love with these characters, with the kids, with the world. It's hard to explain. It's hard to explain the kind of attachment that I got to this show. And I'll compare it, oddly enough, to, or maybe even contrast it to another show that I watched recently, obviously, which is The Penguin. The Penguin, I kept saying, is a brilliant show, but it's not a show that I personally am getting attached to in the same way that I, my top 3 shows. I'm in those shows. I'm attached to these characters, the world. I love the characters. Friends is my favorite show. Not because it's the best written political intrigue, spy thriller or whatever, because it's a comfort show, because it makes me feel good and it makes me feel happy. And just the joy that emanates from these, these first 2 episodes, but particularly this first episode, I was just so happy about that. And so Skeleton Crew, we'll see. We'll see how it changes from here. I might bite my, I might take back my words in a couple months, but I still think that this is easily the best episode, the first episode of Star Wars television that we've gotten thus far. And I mean live action Star Wars television. But guys, let me know what your ranking would be of the first episodes of these Star Wars shows. It might be hard. I had to go online and just, look up some summaries and refresh my memory on what happened in some of these episodes. But still, I still maintain that all these episodes, I didn't dislike any of them. I think that they all started out at a place where you could have easily gone up to be very good shows, all of them. And it's a bummer that most of them didn't, because I think it's just kind of a testament to how starting strong doesn't always mean you're gonna run the whole race really well. So we'll see where Skeleton Crew goes from here, but I am very encouraged by it as well. So guys, let me know in the comments what your ranking would be, and I'd love to hear them and have a discussion about them in the comments. All right, let's talk Creature Commandos, and let's talk the beginning of the DCU. This is the official start of James Gunn's new cinematic universe, or is it? We'll talk about that as we get into Creature Commandos. But guys, this is going to be a full spoiler discussion for episodes 1 and 2 of Creature Commandos, the first project in the DCU. Kind of. Again, we'll talk about it. But anyways, this is going to be full spoiler discussion of episodes 1 and 2 of Creature Commandos. If you have not seen the first 2 episodes, then just make sure to save this podcast, save this segment, save this video for later, and come back once you have. And without further ado, let's get into it. So guys, this is it. This is the DCU, right? I mean, this is going to be the first, when they have the Wikipedia page up and when they talk about the first project in the DCU, it's going to be Creature Commandos. Then again, and I'm not here to, I'm not going to jump the gun too much, but then again, it seems like the Suicide Squad is pretty much canon in the DCU, and so is Peacemaker, so really, I would say the Suicide Squad is the first project in the DCU, kind of. I mean, here's the thing, right? We did a segment about this a couple weeks ago where we talked about James Gunn's clarifying comments on what canon is in the DCU, and he said basically, as long as it's referenced in the DCU and it happened in the DCEU, it just has to be referenced in the DCU for it to be canon. Okay, that's fine. You can have Amanda Waller say here or there, oh, remember that one mission about the starfish? And it's like, okay, that's sure, it's canon. But, I mean, we'll talk about this more when we do our deep dives into episodes 1 and 2. But, I mean, the first episode really starts out and it's like basically an exact continuation of the DCEU. It's literally, look, at this point in time, right, if you told me this show took place in the DCEU, I would have believed you. I don't know what else to say. And maybe that's intentional on James Gunn's part, but it really does not feel like a reboot at all. I mean, this is basically taking place in the same continuity as the DCEU. Now, obviously, we'll see, with Superman coming up, but also then you have Peacemaker Season 2 coming up. So, I mean, yes, this is the first project in the DCU, but does it really feel like it? No, not really, but we'll talk about that later. So, anyways, like I'd been saying before, Creature Commandos as a project, I'm excited for the DCU to start. I'm excited for a new beginning. I'm excited for new things, the new Superman, all that good stuff. The Creature Commandos show, though, I was not super excited about. And as the trailers came out, I made a couple videos on those 2 trailers. And what I said was this. I said, look, I know James Gunn can do this well. And what by this, I mean he can do the ragtag group of villains / anti-heroes / misfits that all come together and they form a bond and they kind of, become a team, and then a couple of them die, and then, they all bond together at the very end to stop a big battle. He does that really well. I mean, Guardians of the Galaxy 1, Guardians of the Galaxy 2, Guardians of the Galaxy 3, the Suicide Squad, Peacemaker, he has done it 5 times, and make it 6, because Creature Commandos is basically, for better and or for worse, it is exactly what I thought it would be, and we'll get into that right about now. So let's do our usual dive into episode 1 and 2. I will do, I took some notes and we'll go through them. These are not long episodes. That's the first thing I noticed, is that these are almost sitcom length episodes, which I was a little surprised by, honestly, because, it's fine, because I think it's what James Gunn wants, and he's able to tell his stories in these 22 minutes or 23 minutes or however long they are, but still, I just think it's interesting that these aren't the 30, 40-minute shows that, the other, I guess, MCU or DCU shows are striving to be, although, the MCU also has 20-minute episodes for some reason. And anyways, so here we go. Episode 1 starts out here, and this is it. This is the DCU beginning. And so, we start out here with this establishing shot. And I will say, in the trailers, the animation looked interesting. It looks stylized, and I said the same thing about the What If trailers way back when the first What If trailer came out. I was like, this is interesting. I actually kind of like the What If animation style. It feels very smooth and very it feels higher quality for some reason. And I will say that this approach to animation, not saying that the people who animated it didn't try or anything like that. It's a choice, right? It's a choice to animate it this way, I think. And it just doesn't feel super. It feels very two-dimensional is what I will say. And the way that the characters are moving, it's very much more classic 2D animation than anything else. And it's a choice. I mean, it's not one that I particularly love, but I don't hate it either. It's just choice that you kind of have to get used to as we go along. We also get some background information here. So Cersei is going to be a character in this show, and she is an Amazon. So that's interesting. We're getting the setup for Themyscira, and it's interesting too because it seems like she is wanting to take over Themyscira. And from what James Gunn had said, Paradise Lost is going to be an HBO Max show that it's kind of a Game of Thrones on Themyscira, and I wonder if that's really what this show is going to be about. It's going to be about Cersei being the villain. We'll see, because I think that would be an interesting setup there for the one of the future DCU projects here. And so then we have now some backstory as Waller is doing the walk and talk with Rick Flag Sr., played by Frank Grillo, and he's going to be showing up a lot. I made a prediction that he's going to be one of the bigger antagonists moving forward of the DCU, maybe a protagonist even, but we'll see. And so she's explaining that Princess Ilana, I think Ilana, is the princess over this nation, which apparently has some oil reserves or something like that. Petroleum, I think, is what Waller said. And then they do basically the same thing. It's the same thing. The profiles, right? This is the Bride. This is Weasel. This is GI Robot. This is Dr. Phosphorus. This is Nina Mazursky. I'm not mad at it, right? I'm just so used to it at this point with these James Gunn projects, like, the walk and talk where Waller's like, this is Christopher Smith, and he does everything you do, and this is Ratcatcher 2, and I'm just kind of over it at this point. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I mean, again, James Gunn doesn't do it poorly at all, but I feel like this is the same thing we've been seeing over and over again. So anyways, there is that. There are also a lot of Peacemaker references here. So, Danielle Brooks's character Adebayo outing her mother, that was referenced, which is a direct, causal link to why they're using these creature commandos. Also Rick Flag Jr. dying. It's a big plot point later. Ilana, sorry. He wanted to say Ileana, like the New Mutants, like magic. But anyways, so it's a big plot point here as Waller references it, and then I think Rick Flag Sr. talks about it later with Ilana. But yeah, Peacemaker references left and right here, and I don't know. It kind of helps lend to this idea that this feels more like a DCEU show than anything else, but we'll see about that. And this show in particular, by the way, just feels like Suicide Squad 2. Except this time it's with Rick Flag Sr. and with not with Rick Flag Jr. So, but it is basically Suicide Squad 2. And so Rick Flag Sr., they all go to this country, and then basically, this whole idea of, I guess this is a big thing going forward, is that Princess Ilana is in love with Rick Flag Sr. Now, whether or not there are ulterior motives, because that happened fast, who knows? Maybe there might be some ulterior motives to wanting to get close to him, and, he's resisting at first, but we'll see. We'll see what happens, because he, eventually falls into that temptation. And then, there's that also that scene, it's classic James Gunn. He does this a lot with his characters where Alexei, right, one of the guards, is just going on and on and on and on about these pop culture references, and I'm like, yeah, this is one of those James Gunn, just let the bit run out, as long as you can. And honestly, in this case, I was like, not a huge fan of it. I don't know. It works a little bit better in Peacemaker for some reason for me, but anyways, in this series, it just wasn't working that well. They again bring up Rick Flag Jr., Joel Kinnaman's character in the Suicide Squad, both Suicide Squad films, and it's a big weight on Rick Flag Sr. So I wonder if that's going to be a plot point that continues to carry on throughout the DCU from the DCEU. It's strange. But it is, it is what it is. And then basically Dr. Phosphorus and Rick Flag fight over that phone that shocks them, and it's. Look, that's basically the first episode, because then at the end, the Bride and Nina Mazursky go to the place where the Bride was created by Victor Frankenstein. And after the first episode, I was just like, well, we're in wait and see mode. I wasn't particularly impressed by this first episode, but we're in wait and see mode. And honestly, as we head into the second episode, I had almost nothing to say because things just kind of happen in this episode. I mean, it's the Frankenstein origin story, and honestly, there's just not a whole lot to talk about here. I mean, there's this really just creepy, weird relationship between Victor Frankenstein and the bride, and then there's, I guess it's kind of sad, the way that Eric Frankenstein views the bride and how, he wants her to love him and all this kind of stuff, but she really doesn't. And I guess that's kind of sad, but, I mean, whatever. And then Cersei attacks them and I don't think they're dead. Nina Mazursky and the bride, if they are dead, I don't really care about them as characters because we spent maybe 15 minutes of screen time with them total across 2 episodes. So yeah, there's that. And then the Rick Flag princess arc is continuing on and Cersei's there. And that's really it. That's really all that happens in episode 2. And, I'm so used to diving into details here in the spoiler discussions and talking about all these little things I noticed and how my thoughts changed as I was watching these episodes. These 2 episodes were so kind of alarmingly similar in the way that I was sitting there watching them going like, oh, I mean, yeah, it is exactly what I thought it would be. It is just James Gunn doing his James Gunn formula on Creature Commandos, and it's fine. I don't think there's anything in here where I was like, I just hate this show, but it's so fine, and it's just so it's just happening, and I haven't really experienced that in a while where I'm just sitting there going, I'm just taking in the show and saying it's going on. But I think that's sort of where we are with Creature Commandos. Am I excited to see episode 3? I don't know. Not particularly excited, but interested? Sure. I mean, I'm interested to see where this is going on. Honestly, though, at a certain point, even if the show doesn't really work for me, I mean, because again, I don't think I'm going to hate the show or anything like that. I just don't think at this point I'm going to love the show, but we'll see. We'll see. I at the very least, though, we can at least be looking at hints towards the DCU, which I think is something that I was already on, the lookout for at the beginning. But I guess if nothing else, there is that. So yeah, I mean, I really was not the biggest fan of these first 2 episodes. I thought that they were fine, and I just thought they were about what I expected, just James Gunn doing James Gunn things. And we'll see where it goes from here, honestly, because I'd be curious to see if, if this can kind of go the Peacemaker route, because Peacemaker, I think, was much better in terms of just grabbing you in the first couple episodes and making you care about these characters, this team. I don't have any attachment to this team at all right now, but we'll see. That might change very soon, just depending on where this series goes. Again, everything James Gunn has done, I've liked. So I don't doubt that, there's going to be a lot to like in this series. I just don't know when that's going to happen. So we'll see about that. But guys, let me know what you thought about the first 2 episodes of Creature Commandos in the comments, and let me know what you're excited about. Looking forward to the DCU and looking forward to Creature Commandos continuing on. Let me know in the comments down below. Alright guys, so in previous episodes of the Access Blockbusters pod, we talked about James Gunn's comments about how the DCEU canon is going to function in the DCU. So we're getting a little bit more clarity. Obviously, we talked about Creature Commandos, but we're getting some more clarity now as the DCU actually kicks off officially. But now, in addition to Creature Commandos and in addition to those comments that James Gunn has made about the canonicity of the DCEU, we've gotten some more comments here about how the MCU is going to, not the MCU, the DCU is going to differ from the MCU. I have an article here from the Direct, which compiles just a few quotes here from James Gunn that we're going to go through, as I like to do. So we're going to read through some of these quotes here and then discuss what they mean on the other side, because I think it's interesting. I think this gives some insight into what James Gunn's DCU is going to look like, and I think that I'll say this. There are many, many individual things to take from this. A lot of little lessons and little hints at what the DCU could look like. And obviously, we're not even going to really know what the DCU looks like until 2 projects at least are out, because right now, it's just Creature Commandos, right? Even with Peacemaker and the Suicide Squad kind of sort of being canon to the DCU, whatever. But we're not going to know what the DCU proper is going to look like until at least Superman, and even then, probably not until a few projects are done and completed with. But I think in general, there is one very good thing about this. One thing that I'm excited about, I should say. Not necessarily good and bad. That's a false dichotomy here. But more just one thing I'm very excited about with James Gunn's approach to the DCU. And one thing I'm perhaps a little more cautious about. I'm not excited about this. I'm not nervous about this necessarily. I just think that this is one of the quote unquote detriments to doing it this way that I think James Gunn is fully aware of, by the way. But I think that, it's just something that he has considered and decided to take the risk on. So we're going to read some of these quotes here, and then we'll talk about it on the other side. I'm reading this article from the Direct, who has compiled quotes directly from James Gunn. So James Gunn was answering a question on Threads And the question was, will you ever do a release schedule like Feige for MCU, or will you just say another movie is in development when it starts? James Gunn responds, it won't be exactly like Marvel because nothing is greenlit before we have a finished script. Okay. Then we move on to this next quote here, where James Gunn, this is him talking to Collider. So again, it's not, it's compiled quotes here, but I think that this all tells a story, a very interesting story that I wanted to bring to light here about how the MCU is going to be different from the DCU and vice versa. So this is another quote here from Collider, and James Gunn says, there's no set timeline for anything. The one thing I've tried to make clear to people from the beginning, and the way I hope we're different, is that everything at DC is going to be based on the writers. He then says, this is the same interview, I believe, until we have a screenplay that I'm totally happy with, then that movie is not going to get made, no matter what it is. And so we have been really fortunate with some screenplays, but it's all going to be based on the story, because at the end of the day, if we're happy with the story that we're telling, then that's what matters most. And I think that is, actually there's one more quote here, as James Gunn is talking about the MCU. So he says here, back in the day, when I came to Hollywood, Scooby-Doo got greenlit because people liked the script. You may not like the movie, but it got greenlit because people like the script. And today, people are greenlighting projects because the IP has to be out on a certain date, which means that the screenplays are worse and movies are suffering for it. So again, maybe not directly about the MCU, but I'm sure in some sort of reference to the MCU. So let's go quote by quote here, as I like to do, because I think that there's a lot to take away from these comments that James Gunn is saying. So first of all, he says, it won't be like Marvel because nothing is greenlit before we have a finished script. Now, for those of you who don't know, Marvel, and I don't think it's the case with every single project they do. I know it's the case for some projects, and maybe even the majority of the projects, where they go in to their productions not having a finished script, and they kind of work on it, along the way. I think that leads to projects like Doctor Strange: The Multiverse of Madness that had some production issues, et cetera, because the script kept changing. And I think that is obviously, I think first and foremost, obviously that's the downside of what Marvel does, especially when the quality control that used to be there with the amount of projects coming out, maybe like 3 movies a year, it's now something like 3 movies and 4 shows a year or something like that. So the quality control that Kevin Feige and his creative team had exerted is not as strong anymore, which means that if scripts aren't done, right, and they're in flux as they enter production, then it's really, it's hard to make those changes. And that's why some projects go through extensive reshoots, etc. Although most big movie projects go through extensive reshoots these days, no matter what they are, even if they're really good, right? So there is that. But yeah, that is definitely the downfall here. And on the surface, sure, it's a great idea. Obviously, have a finished script before you enter production, because you could end up with a project like Multiverse of Madness, which changed many, many times during its production. So there is that. Next thing he says here, there's no set timeline for anything. The one thing I've tried to make clear from people from the beginning is that everything at DC is going to be based on the writers. Again, it's fair, right? It's a fair assessment to say we want the script to be really good before we head into production. And then he says here in the next quote, until we have a screenplay that we're totally happy with, then, and he says here that they've been pretty fortunate thus far. So it seems to indicate that the screenplays they've gotten thus far have in fact aligned with the overall story that he wants to tell with the DCU. But he does indicate, and he does acknowledge that is not always going to be the case, right? Because, sometimes they're just going to be waiting on a project and they're just not going to be happy with it. But James Gunn is saying, instead of just going forward with it just because, they're going to wait on a good script. And he indicates as much in the final and fourth quote here, where he says, basically, just because they've staked out, I'm just going to make up an MCU movie that's not really been announced, Black Panther 3. Just because, Kevin Feige says Black Panther 3 has to come out in, August of 2028, for example. And it's 2027, and Ryan Coogler is not done with the script, but it's just got to go. James Gunn is saying that is detrimental to the quality of films, and that is, that's basically how it is. So, and films are suffering for it. So there is that. So here is what I will say about this, because again, there are a lot of little lessons to take here. For example, he says that they've gotten lucky so far, so it seems like the scripts that he has seen for the DCU pretty much align with him. I will say basically 3 out of the, I don't know how many projects they've put into production, but 3 out of those projects are his projects, Creature Commandos, Peacemaker, and Superman. So there's the cynical side of me that wants to say, well, James, you say it's all based on the writers, and you say you've been fortunate thus far. That's because you've written about half of what's in production for the DCU. That's the cynical side of me. Again, it doesn't really matter, because he's acknowledging that, sure, that's, that may be the case for now, but in the future, it may not always be the case. But again, I say this because, there's two things I take away from this overall. One, really good, and one, I'm interested, cautious and interested. The really good thing about this is obviously, James Gunn is prioritizing quality and he's going to say, we want a finished script here before we get on to anything else. And that's great, right? Because that's what we want. We want the quality control that Marvel had so tightly gripped at the beginning, and it seems like they're starting to get back to it for, at this point here. And it seems like James Gunn, who is a great writer, he is a really gifted writer, and if he is the quality control, right, and he reads a script and he's like, nope, we're not ready for it, then it's not going to happen. That's great. That is great, right? I think that is something that should be admired, and I'm hoping that leads to some great projects. Obviously, James Gunn himself is the one who's written, I think, the first 3 projects of the DCU, being Creature Commandos, Superman, and Peacemaker. So, take that for what you will. But I think that overall, that's a really good thing. The other thing, though, the flip side of that, because like I said, the negative part about not having a script in entering production, especially in a shared cinematic universe like the MCU, is you get films like Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, because it was trying to tie into WandaVision, and it was going to come out before Spider-Man No Way Home, and it was going to come out after Spider-Man No Way Home because of COVID delays and production delays, and so they had to change the story. This is what happens. It's a chaotic mess. And I personally think Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is fine. I think it's fine. But sure, could it have been better if they had really honed in on the script and they had kind of said, let's not really focus on the continuity things, we'll take care of that later? Sure, absolutely. But I will say, it's interesting because one of the reasons the MCU was so successful in the beginning was because of this rigidity in their story structure. And I don't just mean individual movies. I mean the timeline of films that were coming out. Sure, in phase 3 of the MCU, could you have flip-flopped a few projects here and there? Like, would it have made any difference at all if Guardians 2, Spider-Man Homecoming, and Thor Ragnarok, swapped places all around? Not really, no. Because, again, there wasn't a whole lot that just continued to tie into one another until Black Panther kind of ties into Infinity War, Thor Ragnarok, the post-credit scene. So, no. I mean, would it have made a huge difference? No. But, I wonder, right, if Kevin Feige himself was going about the same principle, would it have been possible to have made a cohesive, overarching narrative to the MCU that was so incredibly satisfying in Infinity War and Endgame if you didn't have this rigidity? I don't know. On top of that, I also wonder how much creativity was spawned because of these, forced circumstances where writers and directors were like, okay, we got to figure out this story. I don't know the answer to this. I'm not saying it's a good thing or not. I really am not. I'm just saying, I don't know. Maybe, perhaps. There was some good that came out of it, because look at the 23 MCU projects that came in the Infinity Saga. Iron Man, right? Infamously, Iron Man actually did not have a finished script, and they kept talking about that. Jon Favreau was like, yeah, we shot the movie without a finished script. Iron Man is great. And out of the first 23 projects, I would be willing to bet that not a lot of them had finished scripts entering production, and I love a good amount of them. I like almost all of them. I dislike maybe 1 or 2, and I'm neutral on a couple. Like, that's amazing. So I just think inherently the way that Marvel had been doing it anyways, and it's fine if James Gunn doesn't want to do it this way, but the way that Marvel had been doing it inherently, it didn't seem like, as long as they had the quality control of Kevin Feige, didn't seem like it was necessarily a bad thing, actually. And James Gunn saying movies are suffering for it, sure. In general, it's not good to have an unfinished script entering production, but I think the way that Marvel had gotten a handle of it before, obviously, COVID, I think that was a good thing. And the other thing, the flip side of that for the DCU, is that I wonder what James Gunn's ability to tell a cohesive story is going to be like if he insists upon this strategy. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. I'm not at all. I just wonder, how are you going to be able to tell a Justice League film? Because sure, you wrote the first 3 projects, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I think he wrote the first 3 projects, and he seems happy with Supergirl and Lanterns and whatnot. But, let's just say he really wants to tell a, what is there? Like a Flash movie, for example. Not the Ezra Miller one, but just, he wants to tell a Flash movie. And, let's just say that in his mind, in his envisioned Justice League film, Flash is a pretty important character, but just the script, just like the original Flash movie, stalls. And it just doesn't get to the place where he wants it to. Are you just going to postpone the Justice League movie indefinitely until you get it right? I don't know. And so I just wonder. I wonder what this strategy is going to do for the cohesiveness of the DCU as a whole. Because again, that is, for all the faults of Marvel post-Endgame, right? And the way that their quality has dipped overall, and the way that they haven't really gotten a tight handle on the ship of the storyline that's going forward towards Secret Wars and Doomsday. It is true, though, I think the flip side is that in the Infinity Saga, it is because of this rigidity of schedule that they were able to pull off what was probably one of the biggest miracles of cinema ever, is just telling one general cohesive story across 23 different projects. James Gunn doesn't seem intent on doing that necessarily, although we'll see if he ever makes a Justice League film or does team-up movies. But if it's really on the script, I just wonder what that's going to look like there. Again, in general, I'm saying this is a good thing, obviously, but I also am curious to see where it will go from here. So we are getting more hints, guys, of the DCU and what it will look like. What do you think about James Gunn's comments here? Do you think this is a good thing? Do you think it's not a good thing? Let me know in the comments down below. And guys, that will do it for episode number 52 of the Access Blockbusters pod. We are going to continue barreling forward with Dune Prophecy. We're over halfway done, or I guess at halfway, and we'll be heading over halfway. And then Creature Commandos and Skeleton Crew are just starting up. So we will see where we go from there. And hopefully you'll be able to check out some of the movies like KRAVEN the Hunter, we'll see. Mufasa the Lion King, yeah, we'll see. We'll see. Maybe even the Lord of the Rings film. So make sure to stay tuned on the Access Blockbusters channel for reviews and, there's just some thoughts on those. But guys, thank you so much again, as always, for listening. It means a lot to me. Make sure to subscribe to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel if you haven't already. Make sure to rate the podcast on Spotify if you're listening there, and I will see you guys in the next one.